You saw Sound of Freedom before I did. It's a movie that gets into the nooks and crannies of child trafficking. Not a subject there's many movies made about. And it gives you a glimpse, making you uncomfortable, but without showing anything really explicit. It's kind of fascinating when you think about this movie. Powerful, moving, touching. Let's do a review of this so people can understand the Sound of Freedom movie. It's amazing how well it's done. You saw it before I did. What's your overall review of it, Nate?
Yeah, it was a very well done movie. And I think as many of you probably know, it was put out, or I don't know, it was put out by or distributed by Angel Studios. I don't know if they produced it or what, because it was made like
They
5 years
bought it.
ago. But
Yeah, they had bought it.
yeah,
Somehow Disney ended up owning it, didn't want to put it out. Angel bought it.
right,
Power
yeah,
move.
right.
And then they dropped it. And so it was completed like 5 years ago. Surprise hit. Opens 4th of July weekend. Beats Indiana Jones? What?
Yeah, no, it's a very well done movie. Some people like to call it a Christian movie, which it isn't. There's nothing really. There's it's not really a faith based movie. There's like one line in there where he's like, where the Jim Caviezel character, or based on the real life person, says, God's children are not for sale, which was a really powerful line. But it was just straight up a movie just highlighting the horrors of child trafficking, but in a way that, like you said, doesn't unnecessarily show the suffering of the children. It's implied, and you can kind of see the effects of it afterwards in the performance of the children who played those who were trafficked. And it was amazing, the job on the children as well. The child performers, I think, really tugging at the heartstrings. There was one moment in particular I can remember where Jim Caviezel's character finds this boy, and I think the boy is told to go by the name Teddy Bear or something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's not his real name, and which we know because we had seen him in the beginning with his sister and his father before he was kidnapped. And I remember when Tim Caviezel character asked him, "What's your name?" He says his traffic name,
Yeah.
and you could hear people in the audience just like really like, some people gasped. Someone was like, "No, it's not." You could tell that they were really impacted by it. And so I think this whole movie just had a way of doing that, in a way that you felt like you could not necessarily bring the whole family, but it's not like gratuitous. And I mean, I would say those who are maybe easily triggered or have past traumas should consider whether or not they should see it, especially if you have trouble dealing with like child suffering and things like that, because that is dealt with. But I think it was a very important movie to see, to kind of highlight the fact that this is still going, this kind of thing is going on, that we don't really think about that. The idea that children are being kidnapped and trafficked for various things, including people's sexual desires. And it's just, it's a thing, and we just don't think about it. So I'm glad that they put out this movie, and they did it in a way that was, I hate to say entertaining, but it compelled you. It kept you, I think, hooked throughout the movie, and you didn't
Yeah,
feel
the
like it was
acting,
budgeted. Yeah, great
scenes,
acting.
everything.
Yeah, yeah, everything about it was great. You didn't feel like they were they had to get like third tier actors or something like that. And Jim Caviezel was amazing in it. It's good. It was nice to see him in something else again. So it really moved me.
Sorry, oops. I accidentally just moved you literally
You
when
you
I
moved
did
you
that
moved me.
accent. Yeah, I see. Oh, yeah, someone is saying that's too much for me. Look, the movie is the kind of movie the Christians should support. Although, yeah, it's true. It's not technically really it's not a Christian movie. You might say that it's friendly in a sense to interested people of faith, although you would hope that
Mm.
anyone with a conscience who cares for children and loves their neighbor in any meaningful way would be impacted and touched. But it's been odd. The media is, for the most part, trying to do a smear job on it, saying it's part of a QAnon conspiracy and all these kinds of things. But the movie was done before all that was hype. You
Yeah.
already had Ruslan talked about that, and I've appreciated a lot of the Christian YouTubers and stuff telling people how good it is. Go see it. You can buy tickets for people so they can go see it. So this is definitely something to see. You won't regret it, I think, overall, as far as its quality and all that. But it's definitely emotionally jolting, like Nate said. And what I'm going to do tonight and for the rest of the broadcast, it's not to try to tell people not to see it. It's just to know the full landscape. Most of us are Protestants. We already knew that Jim Caviezel was Roman Catholic. Most people knew that. Um, not everybody knew that Tim Ballard, the person at the center of the movie, the agent at the time, he works for Homeland Security. Now he's involved with nonprofits. Most people knew that, or I'm sorry, not as many people knew that he was LDS, but it's easy to find if you look into it. So that's really what I'm going to be talking about today, sort of the faith of Tim Ballard, but specifically some books he's written. So the person that Jim Caviezel plays is named Tim. And I'm going to look at Timothy Ballard's books. One in particular, but the way I'm going to do it today primarily is to show some audio clips from interviews he's done where he gives lectures from these books, going back as far as 11 years ago. The first clip I'm going to show is actually with Glenn Beck. And so very interesting stuff we're going to be looking at tonight, and actually relates to the study of this channel, Hebrew Israelism, because a lot of it has to do with who Israel is. So I encourage people to stick around because we got a lot of fascinating stuff tonight. Nate, what are your final words on this movie? Does sound like you encourage people to see it, although you gave some warnings, which I appreciate. Any final summary thoughts? And I appreciate you coming on doing a late night review. Thank you.
Yeah, I think definitely people should go see it. I don't know if it's still available or not. If it is, I think you can. It is okay.
It
Yeah.
is.
So,
I was out there tonight.
oh, okay.
I saw Turtles tonight, and Sound of
Oh,
Freedom is still on the marquee.
okay. So I'm assuming then that it's still available, or that people are still paying it forward to. You can get free tickets for it.
Mm-hmm.
I'm guessing. So I would. Yeah. I mean, unless if you like I said, if you have trouble seeing child suffering and things like that, and it's just like really triggering to you, maybe consider not seeing it. But I think for everyone else, it's a riveting movie. It's the kind of thing you wouldn't regret buying a ticket for. It is a hopeful movie, I think. So
Mm-hmm.
I don't think you have to worry about coming away. I will say I came away wrecked, but it does you do come away with hope as
Mm-hmm.
well. And so definitely, yeah. I mean, I think I give the movie 5 out of 5 stars. I definitely recommend it, and I think it brings to the forefront a subject matter that we don't talk enough about. So I think it's good that this movie was made so that we can at least have the discussion. I know there's a lot of controversy, like Vocab said. I don't really understand it because really you watch the movie, all it is highlighting child trafficking and nothing else. I think we can agree that that's a bad thing, and it needs to be discussed more because we don't really think about it that much.
Yeah, and you can look up on the websites of the people promoting the movie, and they'll tell you which parts happen for real and which parts are, dramatized or fictional for the sake of the movie. The movie's not 100% a true story, but that it's based on a true story, and so they tell you which parts are which. So it's not, there's some people out there trying to make it out like it's lying. That's not it, and as long as you know what's what, it's all good. The basic element is true, though, and that's important. So I want to read one scripture verse before you go. It's Mark chapter 10, and look here what Jesus says. This is verse 13. People were bringing little children to Jesus for him to place his hands on them, But the disciples rebuked them. When Jesus saw this, he was indignant. He said to them, "Let the little children come to me. Do not hinder them, for the kingdom of God belongs to such as these. Truly I tell you, anyone who will not receive the kingdom of God like a little child will never enter it." And he took the children in his arms, placed his hands on them, and blessed them. So I love to see that, Jesus, God in human flesh, takes his time to not just be with children, but he's warm with them. It says he placed his hands on them. And then people that try to stop him, his own followers, he said, no, let them come. Don't stop them. And then he uses their mentality as an illustration of the kind of faith and trust we need to have. And then he shows his love for these children, says, place them in his arms, place his hands on them, bless them. It's a beautiful picture of our Savior and how he interacts with young children. And Christians should care about the most vulnerable and see that and preserve that. And so that's why I like this movie. So thank you, Nathan, very much for coming on and sharing tonight.
Sure. Thanks for having me.
Yes, sir. Now we got to move on to the grimy stuff.
Yep, you can take care of that.
All right, I am. So I'm going to start with the first clip right now, ladies and gentlemen. And this is Tim Ballard, the star of the show. And it's going to be him with Glenn Beck 11 years ago. And I'm going to explain everything here. But I think this first clip will help us understand what's going on. They're talking about American history here, specifically Christopher Columbus. Let's find out what's going on as we look at the LDS, Latter-day Saint books, by Timothy Ballard as an author. Here's the first clip.
Prophecies, his diary, he named it this. Mm-hmm. He understood, he understood things so profound. He understood the connection to Israel. He believed that his discovery of this new world, what he thought was the Indies, he believed that this was going to create something, start a chain of events that would actually
reestablish Israel.
Exactly,
right.
Exactly.
And that's exactly the same thing that the Pilgrims felt.
Exactly. The Pilgrims get here. They call themselves the New Israel. John Winthrop gives the speech of American literature, the City on the Hill speech. That's an invocation of the covenant. And he says, in his writings, it's a capital C, he puts the covenant. We're making a covenant. We're taking out a commission, he says. And he repeats the same pattern. I mean, it's like reading the Old Testament all over again, reading American history. They name their towns after Israelite towns. Salem, for example, a derivative from Jerusalem. They name their children Hebrew names all upon them.
One of my favorite stories is George Washington makes this covenant.
All right. That is Glenn Beck, somewhat well-known conservative host of a variety of media involved these days with Blaze TV. He is a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And there he's with the author. This clip is from 11 years ago. That's the author right there, Tim Ballard. That's the one that Jim Caviezel plays in the movie Sound of Freedom. And did you understand what is being said there? Did you understand what's being said? They're talking about this idea of covenant that America had with God. But understand that this is a LDS view of this. Because, see, Glenn Beck is a Mormon. Tim Ballard is a Mormon. Tim Ballard has written several books on this. The Covenant, One Nation Under God, America's Sacred and Immutable Connection to Ancient Israel. So Timothy Ballard is the same person as Tim Ballard. If you look there, that's him. I went to Deseret Books. That is the Mormon bookstore here. We got plenty of them in town. Remember, I live in Phoenix, Arizona. Deseret Books. I picked up a couple of books by Tim Ballard. I've actually read one in its entirety, and I'm working on this one. And so when he was promoting this idea, this book, now he has newer versions of it. He went on Glenn Beck and talked about it. Fascinating to hear this from an LDS perspective. This one came out in 2012, by the way. This one came out just a few years ago. The one I'm going to be talking about tonight, the Pilgrim Hypothesis. So that's an introduction to it. Now let's look at some other clips, and this will help you understand why this, you will find Israel mentioned several times. Israel is very important in these discussions, Tim Ballard. So let's play the next clip Dave on this book.
Of his 10 children, he had one son named John Jr., and he had a daughter named Hope. Hope's great-great-great-granddaughter was Emma Smith. John Jr.'s great-great-great-grandson was Joseph Smith. So now the prophecy comes alive. Now we understand why John had that Mayflower. So was that Ephraim coming across? Absolutely. This was Ephraim coming across. This was Joseph's prophecy being fulfilled once again. And the miracles, of course, accompany this movement.
Okay, there's a lot there to unpack if you don't understand LDS theology and history. So just hang with me on this program tonight, focusing on Mormonism, because the author, Tim Ballard, was in Sound of Freedom. A lot of people talking about the movie, but I don't hear a lot of people talking about the books he's written. I want to talk about those. I'm not saying they're trash or anything like that. I'm here to analyze them from a Christian, Protestant, biblical apologetics, theological perspective, because they are through a skewed lens, specifically an LDS lens, a Book of Mormon lens. Now, what was he talking about just now? What Tim Ballard was talking about just now is how the Mayflower, which is the ship, the vessel that brought the pilgrims over who landed in Plymouth in November of 1620, there was a man on the boat who was single and falls off. Wasn't supposed to be out on the deck at this time, I don't think. He was being a little reckless or whatever happened, maybe a little naive. Goes off the side. But miraculously, there was a rope that was supposed to be tethered in, and he falls multiple fathoms beneath the water. But when he goes back up, his hand feels something. He touches this rope. It's literally in his hand. Gets pulled back up, saved. By providence, of course. Because you got to understand, the Mayflower's not turning around. This isn't a speedboat. It's not able to just go like this. They would never be able to find him again. You fall off the boat, you're dead. You're fish food, you might say. This man survived. It is one of the many providential miracles that we do see with the coming over of these Calvinists. Not sure if people understand the Pilgrims were Calvinists. As they come over, historically, the Pilgrims themselves saw this through a Calvinistic lens, God's sovereignty and control. Tim Ballard can't see that because he places a high emphasis on what Mormons call agency. They don't have a God like you would have in Reformed theology. But he does emphasize this idea of covenant from an LDS perspective, which is essentially, in a loose, general way, if there's faithfulness in the nation, they'll be blessed. Now, that idea itself, I think, is a biblical idea. Doesn't mean the nation necessarily has a covenant with God, though, because then you get into, well, specifically just America or something like that. I think that principle applies across the board, but I would obviously see it from a different lens than Tim. But what Tim says here, and I haven't checked this out, so I can't verify this, is the man who was saved when he goes off the side of the boat was related to Joseph Smith. He was an ancestor of Joseph Smith and Emma Smith, both of them. And he has a video where he shows the family tree, meaning that he was saved so that he could produce the prophet who brought in the restoration, is the way Tim puts it. So look at this clip one more time with that in background.
Of his 10 children, he had one son named John Jr., and he had a daughter named Hope. Hope's great-great-great-granddaughter was Emma Smith. John Jr.'s great-great-great-grandson was Joseph Smith. So now the prophecy comes alive. Now we understand why John Howland could not die.
John
He was
Howland.
bulletproof in every sense of the word. And on that Mayflower, 400 years ago, in this 22-year-old indentured servant who falls off the boat and should have died, in his blood, he carries the father and the mother of the restoration coming across that Mayflower. So was that Eve?
The father and the mother of the restoration. So understand, Mormons believe, just like Hebrew Israelites, that the gospel had been lost and needs to be recovered. The truth of the Bible has been lost and corrupted. Joseph Smith believed he received a vision in 1820, and he published a book in 1830, Book of Mormon, related to all this. And with the Hebrew Israelites, they have a different view, but it's a view called restorationism, is what it's called. And Rob C., yes, of course I agree. And so, bulletproof, he can't die because God's going to bring in the restoration. Now, after he says that, he says something else very interesting. Notice he says, was this Ephraim coming across? Who's Ephraim? Joseph had two sons. Remember this? Ephraim and Manasseh. That's why when you see the 12 tribes chart, when you see the actual real one, like in the Bible, the 12 tribes listed, I'll put it that way. What do you have there? You have Ephraim and Manasseh. You don't have a tribe called Joseph. That's because each is a half tribe. But the way this works out with the land, it makes sense because Levi, of course, doesn't have a parcel of land because Levi is all amongst Israel. So you still can have the 12. Now, Mormons believe that Joseph Smith was 100% Ephraimite, according to the words of Brigham Young. Understand, way before Hebrew Israelism was ever on the scene, Mormons thought that Joseph Smith was literally of Ephraim. Now, if you ask a Hebrew Israelite, because they're influenced by Abba Bivens, if they're a one Wester today, who are the Ephraimites? They actually have on their chart, it's the Puerto Ricans. But neither are right, but Joseph Smith and them guys were first on this. Understand that. That's because they were influenced by variations of Anglo-Israelism and also variations of the Hebraic Indian theory in relationship to the inhabitants of what would become the United States of America. It's a lot to take in. We're learning about this.
Mother of the restoration
Now listen.
coming across that Mayflower. So was that Ephraim coming across? Absolutely. This was.
So he's saying the man has to be Ephraim because Joseph Smith claimed to be of Ephraim, coincidentally, tribe of Joseph. See that? And this man who was his ancestor had to be Ephraim because he's an ancestor to Joseph Smith. So he's saying that part of the group who came across with the Pilgrims, they were Ephraimites from the tribe of Ephraim. He's saying the Pilgrims were Israelites. Do you understand that? Now, there's 102, I think, Pilgrims, and they came from a Leiden congregation, the Leiden congregation. And I think about only half of the Pilgrims were from there because they had other folks. So not all the Pilgrims would have actually even been believers. And so, according to his understanding, they wouldn't have all been of Ephraim. Now, we have some people here talking. Repent says coincidence, fabrication. No, this really happened. The man really was saved. It really is a miracle of God. We should be glad that the man was saved. Pilgrims needed all the people they could get. But the question is it to save Joseph Smith, if that's even the case. And we are going to talk about Masonry a little bit here, Thin Blue Line Soldiery, because Tim Ballard actually brings it up. And I'm not sure what this is, but we do hold to Providence, and we do hold to Romans 8:28 theology over here. Now, let's take a look at some more clips. The eyes of Joseph Smith. The eyes of the... Is this the same clip? Am I messing up here? Hold on. Let me see. Make sure I'm not playing the same one that I just played. Come on now. By the way, be sure to like this video. I know it's late, so not everybody comes in. But I would like it if you did come in. And we need some more people, so contribute to the algorithm. All right, so it's giving me a little bit of problems, but I got a way around that. So just let me see here. All right, there we go. Let's get this over here. How y'all doing tonight, by the way? Shout out to the dopest mods in the business. See D New coming through. Of course, I see Nate. He does it all. He goes from host to to guest to okay, there it is. Come on, please work.
Significant than most of our history books, especially our classroom. This is an exciting year, 2020. Not only is the 200th anniversary of the first vision, but it's actually also the 400th anniversary of the landing of the Mayflower at Plymouth. And this story of the Pilgrims coming to America is so significant, so much more significant than most of our history books, especially our classroom textbooks, give it credit for. There's two questions we need to ask about the Pilgrims to understand this great event and what we're celebrating this year and commemorating.
So this is 2020 when Tim Ballard, again, the man featured, the real life person that the Sound of Freedom star Tim is based upon. In his book here, this is the Pilgrim Hypothesis, one of his books. He's got a page that says shared anniversaries. Shared anniversaries and shared godly purposes. So he's got 1620, Pilgrim's Land. 1820, Joseph Smith has his vision. 1630, Massachusetts Bay Colony Puritans arrive on the Promised Land. So the Puritans came after the Pilgrims, not necessarily the same group. Notice he calls it the Promised Land. This is considered Zion by Mormons. The United States of America is New Zion. And then 1830, the anniversary that he gives, is the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is established. That's the year the church, the LDS Church was established, and the year that Joseph Smith published the Book of Mormon. So he's tying this all in together. Very interesting. Listen to this.
First, why did they come here? And second, who were they? Once we answer those questions, this entire world comes to life. And that world has to do with the restoration of the gospel and the gathering of Israel. So why did the Pilgrims
Did you hear that
come?
last part? And the gathering of Israel. So understand that a faithful Mormon looks at the founding of America as part of God's gathering of Israel. Because remember, he is holding, and if the man who fell off the boat is really an ancestor to Joseph Smith, you would have to hold that he's an Ephraimite if you take Joseph Smith and Brigham Young's words seriously, that Joseph Smith himself is of Ephraim. Now, they're holding that the Pilgrims are of Israel, literally. However, that doesn't mean that they knew that they were, but they sort of incidentally, because of their interest and love of the Bible, do Israelite-like things. Remember in the previous clip, he talked about how they named a bunch of the towns after biblical names. By the way, which is true. You can't deny the biblical worldview of the Pilgrims and the Puritans. I mean, even their names tell you when you understand what those groups are about. Salem, where infamously the Salem witch trials happened, was the city of peace like Jerusalem. That's where these names come together from. But here's what you got to understand. There was a lot of people who believed that there may have been the final days upon us and that America may have played a role. This is fledgling America, right? And that Israel would be part of it in some way. This was actually in the water. And so in the 1820s, remember, America's founded in 1776. Supposedly, Joseph Smith's grandpa fought under George Washington. 1820, when Joseph Smith, as a teenage boy, says he received his vision, it's not that far from the founding of the United States of America. 1776, 1820, do the math. You see, it's not that far. So, right here, kind of in the beginning, when New York was still kind of a frontier, basically. I mean, real frontier is more out Missouri and whatnot, which they'll eventually get to there as well. But New York is still of a rough area in a different way. So, Tim Ballard is talking about this from an LDS perspective. And remember, this book subtitle right here, The Pilgrim's Hypothesis, that he put out in 2020. Look at the subtitle. Exploring the possible connections between the restoration of the gospel, the gathering of Israel, and the Pilgrims who founded America. How is this not utterly fascinating? I hope
That decision to stay in the mud was the gospel of Jesus Christ. the restoration of the priesthood, the restoration of temples in the land. This was a major part of the gathering of Israel, which leads us to the other question, who were they? To understand who the pilgrims were, we go back to Genesis 49.
I'm going to stop right there. A few things here. What he emphasizes is that whenever you have American principles exported in some way to other parts of the world, you'll notice what follows is the building of Mormon temples. This is all related to their view of the end times. Remember, the Mormon church, it's not called the Mormon church, is it? They're called the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Latter-day means end days or final days. There was definitely an air of expectation of the end of final things within the early LDS movement. And their name still is that. And I even saw some eschatological books when I went to Deseret Books, the Mormon bookstore. Do you understand all this? And they relate the promulgation of their temples as being related to this, all tied in together. And so what he's saying is when America exports its values, it equals more temples in those same lands. So this is all tied into him. To him, America is key to what Heavenly Father is doing in the end times. And in fact, it's a beautiful tagline that Sound of Freedom, the movie, had, isn't it? God's children are not for sale. I encourage you to wear the shirt. It's all good. However, understand for a Mormon man, that is meant literally. We as Christians don't think this way, but understand that Mormons believe that Heavenly Father, literally, with a heavenly consort named Heavenly Mother, produced everyone on earth that you see. In the premortal existence, as Mormons believe, they were known as intelligences, and then they are gifted or granted bodies to come into this earth after being produced. So we're literally God's children on that reckoning. Do you understand what I'm saying here? So when they say God's children are not for sale, the Mormon who says it really means it. Literally. Now, it's still true. We see the term God's children in a different way. Let's continue with this clip now. Putting this all together, you're going to learn a lot today if you stick around and pay attention.
This is an important scripture. One of the most important Old Testament prophecies, when Jacob takes his 12 sons and he prophesies over each of them and over their posterities. And amazing truths are revealed. He takes Judah, for example, and tells him that the Savior of all mankind will come through.
Now, he just mentioned Genesis 49. If you have paid attention to Hebrew Israelism and what I've been teaching through this ministry that I've been doing online and in person, I have definitely brought you to Genesis 49 before. In fact, I have an article on it in the works. This is where Jacob gathers his sons and blesses them. And he gives a little kind of crypto prophecy to each one. And you see Judah in there. This is Genesis 49, verse 8. But you don't see just Judah. You see Issachar. The Hebrew Israelites try to use these verses as ways to discover what ethnicity lines up with which tribe. It's utter foolishness and not true. But Mormons do something similar. And guess what? Mormons did it first. Genesis 49:22 says Joseph is a fruitful vine. Remember, referring to Joseph means Ephraim and Manasseh, because Joseph is two tribes, really. The half tribe of Ephraim and Manasseh equal the one tribe of Joseph. Joseph is a fruitful vine near a spring whose branches climb over a wall. Did you know that Mormons interpret that as the Mayflower coming to America? I'm not kidding. It's official interpretation. With bitterness, archers attacked him. They shot at him with hostility, but his bow remained steady. His strong arm stayed limber because of the hand of the mighty one of Jacob, because of the shepherd, the rock of Israel, because of your father's God who helps you, because of the Almighty who blesses you, with blessings of the skies above, blessings of the deep springs below, blessings of the breast and womb. Your father's blessings are greater than the blessings of the ancient mountains, than the bounty of the age-old hills. Let all these rest on the head of Joseph, on the brow of the prince among his brothers. Remember, Joseph Smith claimed to be a descendant of Joseph from the Bible. Are we following? Are we understanding? Are we listening? Are we paying attention? I hope that we are. Let's go now to the next clip here with Tim Ballard. This is the person speaking. He wrote a book that I have, and he's the star of Sound of
promised
Freedom.
land. Joseph is a fruitful bough, he says to Jacob, says to Joseph, a fruitful bough whose branches run over the wall. And that has been interpreted by the brethren as Joseph's posterity crossing over the great wall of water, because then the prophecy goes on to describe a land.
Okay, did you understand that? So when I just said what I said, I wasn't BSing you. I'm going to let you hear this again. I said that LDS authorities interpret Genesis 49 as descendants of Joseph, specifically. Remember, they're believing here that the pilgrims are descendants of Ephraim because Joseph Smith supposedly came from that. When it says go over now, what is it really describing? It's just saying that Joseph will be productive, that it'll be fruitful, because it's describing essentially like a grapevine that's going even over the wall that it's on. It's a way to describe the because it literally tells you Joseph is a fruitful vine near a spring, so the water's helping it grow, whose branches climb over a wall. So it's very extensive. They're literally taking this and saying we can interpret the Bible because we get revelation from God, because when he says brethren, he's talking about LDS authorities, okay? That means it's a wall of water that the Mayflower will cross over. That's official LDS interpretation. So I don't think Tim Ballard is a dishonest person. He is doing what a serious Mormon man would do, who believes that the Book of Mormon is true, Joseph Smith's a prophet, and these LDS authorities are to be trusted. That's how he's interpreting American history. So listen to this again.
A promised land. Joseph is a fruitful bough, he says to Jacob, says to Joseph, a fruitful bough whose branches run over the wall. And that has been interpreted by the brethren as Joseph's posterity crossing over the great wall of water, because then the prophecy goes on to describe a land of liberty, a land of protection, a land of prosperity. Joseph is to receive this land. Now what happens? The Bible continues. You can read the story. You hear about Judah's prophecies being fulfilled, but what of Joseph? Joseph just disappeared.
So Judah's prophecies, a lot of us have understood, are fulfilled with the coming of the Messiah, for example. And you can find Judah's prophecies there in verse 8, because remember, Jesus is the Lion of the tribe of Judah. So he's saying, okay, we know that, but what about Joseph's prophecies? So he's saying it was fulfilled in the pilgrims.
That posterity gets lost with the lost tribes, goes north, is conquered by the Assyrians, and we hear nothing else.
So he's referring to the lost tribes of Israel. There has been multiple attempts to locate these folks. Hebrew Israelites got their own version. Mormons have their own version. This is something that religious groups have been doing. A lot of you just know about the Hebrew Israelites now, but Mormons did it first. Anglo Israelites did it first. And there's multiple other groups. This is what happens when you don't understand that the church is the new Israel. You go looking for physical Israelites over mountains and hills and valleys.
Only prophecies that Joseph will return someday. And Ephraim, the son of Joseph, will stand tall one day and be a prominent.
Oh, shout out to In Context with Jim Green. Everybody, please subscribe to his channel. He does a great job, which I greatly appreciate. And by the way, Thin Blue Line, I'm not sure what you're saying there. They don't believe Utah is Judah. Judah's a tribe. So not sure what you mean by that. How would Utah be a tribe? I don't think that's correct. They do believe that America is Zion and Missouri is where the Garden of Eden was. We might get into that. But are you following along here? I hope that you are. This is Tim Ballard from Sound of Freedom talking at a real-life lecture he gave.
There's lots of archaeological, scriptural, historical evidence that they ended up in Western Europe, and particularly in the British Isles.
You guys, there's not that many people watching right now. And I get it. First of all, it's late. It's my bad. It's like, what, 1:30 on the East Coast? 1:30 a.m., so yeah, it's my fault. And I know this is not the most popular stuff, and you got to really follow, and it's like, what? Sometimes it's easy to do surface level stuff, and I don't like trying to do surface level stuff. I'm not just trying to entertain. I really do want to try to use this internet thing to educate people, and I love talking about this as well. Understand what is going on here. Listen very carefully. I'm going to play this again and pause it, and we're going to interact with this.
there's lots of archaeological, scriptural, historical evidence that they ended up in Western Europe and particularly in the British Isles.
Sounds like a Hebrew Israelite, except just replace British Isles with Africa. Same deal, baby. He thinks because of the influence of Anglo-Israelism, and he literally mentions Anglo-Israelism in this book that I hold in my hands. He literally mentions Anglo-Israelism. I've discussed Anglo-Israelism several times on this channel, and I'm trying to get you guys to understand it. It's fascinating what he's saying here. He believes that some of the Israelites ended up in Western Europe. Western Europe, understand that here? And so right here, he's talking about Ephraim ending up in Western Europe, and specifically the British Isles. So that's how you're going to get Israelites over here. Let me read from page 82 of the book, okay? I'm going to read from page 82 of the book here. This is the book by Tim Ballard. Let me flip screens here because I know people are going to get a little lost in here. So let's go back here. Let's go back here. Let's see. Okay, here we go. Listen up, people. This is Tim Ballard's book. This is not just Tim. Understand, a lot of Mormons, when you probe deep, believe basically the same thing because their prophets have forced them to. Page 82 says, why? Because there seemed to be something deeper to who these English women and men were. The evidence was adding up too rapidly to ignore the connections to ancient Israel, the applications of the ancient covenant, allusions to a restored gospel of Jesus Christ, and the evidence of a new gathering in America. And now I knew they did experience mind-boggling miracles. I needed to go to England to seek further knowledge, not only because that was where the pilgrims had come from, but because there was something else I needed to discover as well. Remember in the introduction when I quoted Elder Erastus Snow? He made an interesting application of the Genesis 49 prophecy, which foretold of Joseph's posterity crossing over the wall and into America. He suggested that America's settlers, Howland and the Pilgrims, for example, were that prophesied group. But wouldn't that mean they were from the seed of Joseph, like Lehi before them, who made a similar ocean journey? After all, the Genesis 49 prophecy definitely seemed limited to Joseph and his people. I recognize we are entering deep doctrinal waters here, and I'm not certain any conclusion can be proven indefinitely, but I like the hypothesis, and so did Elder Snow apparently. And then he quotes Elder Snow, and I'll read it here. This is Elder Erastus Snow. Somebody look him up. Elder Erastus Snow. Find out when he lived exactly. Please look that up for me. Drop it in the chat. I want to see what you say here. This is a Mormon authority. Now, the same spirit of revelation that sought out the prophet Joseph Smith from the loins of Joseph, who was sold into Egypt, and that raised him up in this last dispensation to receive the keys of the priesthood and to lay the foundation of this great work in the earth, has also called the children of Abraham from among the kingdoms and countries of the earth to first hear and then embrace the everlasting gospel. This is a Mormon talking. This is what they believe. Then the remnants of the seed of Ephraim, who were scattered from Palestine and who colonized the shores of the Caspian Sea and thence made their way into the north of Europe, penetrating Scotland and England and mingling their seed with the Anglo-Saxon race and spreading over the waters a fruitful vine as predicted by Jacob, whose branches should run over the wall. Their blood has permeated European society and it coursed in the veins of the early colonists of America. That's a picture of the guy. Now, the movie itself doesn't have a whole lot of LDS stuff. I am not against the Sound of Freedom. I have a nuanced position here. Go see the movie. I think Christians should support it, especially with all the garbage out of Hollywood. This is a good cause we can get behind, okay? So this is not banging. I don't do that. He's a man. I'm critiquing his ideas as a man. To me, he still is a real-life hero. We need more people like him as far as his actions in this world. However, I'm allowed to critique his ideas as a Mormon that he has, me as a Bible-believing Christian. In fact, I should, according to 2 Corinthians 10, 3-5. Should I not? See what I'm saying? So that's where we are with this. I want you to see the movie, but I want you to be aware of LDS theology. The movie doesn't have really this in there, ladies and gentlemen. I'm just using it as a chance to talk about these ideas because it's not just Tim. Understand, you're learning a lot about LDS belief here. Let me, though, continue page 83. Ready? He then goes on to not only identify these American colonists and revolutionaries as being from this British line born of Joseph through his son Ephraim, but he also explains their role as Ephraimites in fighting tyrants, bringing and upholding liberty upon the American continent, and, quote, thus preparing the way for the coming forth of the fullness of the everlasting gospel, end quote. So Mormons believe pilgrims paved the way for the restoration of the gospel via Joseph Smith, and they themselves, even though they did not know it, are actually Ephraimites. For me, the most compelling part of Elder Snow's statement is his reference to Joseph Smith being from the loins of Joseph of old, for that is scriptural. This is what Tim Ballard says. The Lord told Joseph of Egypt, quote, a choice seer will I raise up out of the fruit of thy loins. 2 Nephi 3:7. 2 Nephi 3:7 is from the Book of Mormon. So Joseph Smith in his own book has a prophecy about himself. Now, I know that Tim Ballard legitimately believes that Joseph Smith translated, in essence, an ancient document about the Americas and whatnot. We don't have any good reason to believe that, along with him. So this is literally Joseph Smith making prophecies about himself in 2 Nephi 3:7. And his name shall be called after me, Joseph of old said, and it shall be after the name of his father, 2 Nephi 3:15. Do you understand that? Do you guys know that Joseph Smith was a junior? So in Joseph Smith's book, which Mormons won't like me talking that way about the Book of Mormon, but you've got to understand that's how we see it, and I believe it's with good reason. In Joseph Smith's book, he has Joseph from the Bible, the one who was in Egypt as a slave, saying his name shall be called after me, because Joseph is named Joseph, and it shall be after the name of his father, saying he'll be having the same name of his father. Joseph Smith was a junior. Do you guys following what's going on here? This is Mormonism, ladies and gentlemen. Brigham Young added his testimony, quote, Joseph Smith's descent from Joseph that was sold into slavery into Egypt was direct, and the blood was pure in him. Joseph Smith was a pure Ephraimite. Brigham Young said Joseph Smith was a pure Ephraimite. Understand, Brigham Young lived way before One West was around. These folks were saying Joseph Smith and the Pilgrims, basically, were Ephraimites way before Abba Bivens and those guys decided to say Puerto Ricans were Ephraimites. Where did Joseph Smith, this pure Ephraimite, hail from? Where does his lineage begin? The British Isles. The pieces were adding up. Are you following? This is so good. I've got to keep on reading it because not many of you know, but when the Mormons give a temple blessing, did you know that the Mormon males get told what tribe they're from? I text one of my buddies, former Mormon, said, hey, when you got your blessing or whatever, what did they tell you were from? You know what he said? Ephraim. But you know what they told his mom she was from? Manasseh. Now, why is that? Because my friend is Peruvian on his mom's side. So his mother being a Peruvian would be from Manasseh because they believe that most indigenous peoples are from Manasseh, whereas most of the people who would be more European are from Ephraim. So a lot of times indigenous Mormons are told they're from Manasseh, and you have the white Mormons usually be told they're from Ephraim. So they view the rejoining of indigenous Mormons with white Mormons basically as the rejoining of Joseph. Ephraim and Manasseh coming together. Are you following this? Now listen, if you're part of LDS and I'm getting something wrong, understand there's a lot to this. This is very deep, complex. Not many Christians even talk about this. Please understand, I'm never trying to lie about your beliefs. If I get something wrong, just say, hey, you were wrong on this or incorrect on that. I want to critique you, but do so charitably. So please don't accuse me of lying or anything like that. Do my research, but I'm still human. So I need to read this next part to put all this into context before I go back over to Tim Ballard. Page 84 of his book, The Pilgrim Hypothesis. Does this corroborate what Elder Snow said? Was it just Joseph Smith and his line? Or was there a larger ancient migration of the tribe of Joseph through his son Ephraim, as Elder Snow suggested? Did they settle in Britain? Did God pluck the early American pilgrims from that covenant group? A literal regathering of these lost tribes in the promised land of America? Is that why Christ told the Nephites the new nation of America would, quote, be set up as a free people by the power of the Father, that the covenant of the Father may be fulfilled, which he hath covenanted with his people, O house of Israel? That's in 3 Nephi 21:4 from the Book of Mormon. Is this why so many thousands, maybe millions of patriarchal blessings of those with British ancestry in America and elsewhere have identified their recipients as being from Joseph via Ephraim? So when they give the patriarchal blessing, they tell these Mormons, you're from Ephraim. Listen to this. This is a quote. According to a church publication, quote, the lineages declared in patriarchal blessings are almost always statements of actual bloodlines. They are not simply tribal identifications by assignment, end quote. The Mormons claim they're telling people their real bloodlines. So I bring this together because I focus on Hebrew Israelism. A lot of you know that. I'm trying to show you this idea is popular in other religions too. And they were first. Does it not seem likely that early Americans, from William Bradford and John Howland to Georgia Martha Washington and John and Abigail Adams, would be proclaimed as Ephraimites in a patriarchal blessing? Tim Ballard basically thinks George Washington was an Israelite, that John Adams was an Israelite. Do you understand this? And the next line says, that's why I had to go to Britain. Now, look, I'm not making fun of him. Smart man, has a master's degree, great speaker. But I am critiquing these ideas. I'll get back to your comments here in a second. We need to flip back over to Tim Ballard. He's the star of the Sound of Freedom movie, an excellent movie, which I do recommend you to watch. But at the same time, it's got a lot of
So now
ideas from Mormonism in it.
we're connected to the Pilgrims. One time anciently, because the Book of Mormon is the stick of Joseph. So the Book of Mormon is going to tell you.
I know it's a lot to take in. Mormons believe the Book of Mormon is a stick of Joseph, and they use Old Testament prophecy to try to prove that. So he's talking about that. So just follow. If you won't get it all, you'll get it all.
How Joseph got those lands. When Lehi is crossing over with his family, he's very clear, he's very loud and proud about the fact that we are from Joseph, and great were the blessings promised to Joseph. He knew.
This picture that you see on the screen can be found on the front of every single Book of Mormon that the missionaries will give you. Understand, they believe these folks are Israelites pictured here. So, we talk about we don't believe in white Israelites as far as the old ones. We know they would have been darker. Once they go through Europe, however, it's another story, mixing and matching and proselytizing and intermarriage and all that kind of stuff. So we're not denying every single Ashkenazi or anything like that. It's a complicated thing, but we've talked about this before here. But they believe, like for real, they look like this,
That he was, and his family was that group.
I believe that God created you for a specific purpose.
Oh, man, one of my commercials popping up there. Okay, so you see what he's saying there, right? You guys following there? Now let's look at the next clip. So this is, guys, please, I still think people should see the movie. This has nothing to do with the movie. Tim Ballard is teaching this in his book.
Very end of the book, we are told there's going to be a coming again of Joseph to this land. There's going to be a restoration. They knew that it would happen again. And sure enough, it happens again when God takes a remnant of Joseph, Ephraim, takes them across Western Europe into the British Isles. And you really got to read the book to get into the details of all the archaeological and historical evidence of those migrations. Especially the linguistics proves this, how English is really an adaptation and has Hebrew in it because the languages merged and created English. English is about 90% Hebrew, believe it or not. So now the Pilgrims are from that group. Are they Ephraim? Are they the remnant that's going to fulfill this prophecy once again as children of Joseph, coming to the land of Joseph. The early generations of the church used to call America the land of Joseph for a reason. So these pilgrims get on the Mayflower.
Okay. So he's saying a lot here. And look, I guess I have to keep on reiterating this. Look, there's a lot of nonsense on the internet. There's a lot of conspiracy theories, and there's a lot of shallow, simplistic thinking. We live in a complicated world. Christians need to be able to sort this out. Yeah, there's black and white, left and right, right and wrong. That's a fact. But we need to be wise as serpent, harmless as doves. So this is not me telling you not to see the movie. I'm telling you to see the movie. I'm telling you that you recognize who he is. He is out there rescuing children. And yes, there's parts of the movie that are fiction, but they tell you which ones are which if you read their own website, the R website, O-U-R. This is someone who is doing something Christians should applaud on that side. Theologically, there's some truth to what he's saying. God providentially being there. When you read of Plymouth Plantation by William Bradford, where he talks about what happened, you should be able to see the hand of God, I think, as a Christian. He's interpreting it through an LDS lens, though. And he's making some conclusions and leaping to places you shouldn't be going to. That's what we're trying to get at today. So I hope that my audience, instead of trying to show how much you know about Mormonism or talk about all this other stuff you heard on other channels, can you just follow what we're talking about here today? Because I know most of you don't know what I'm talking about.
So fast forward.
Back to John Howland. By the way, that was the John Howland. Remember, that was the John Howland that was saved there. All right, here we go.
So fast forward a minute about these prophecies in Genesis 49 and who these pilgrims might have been, who they were. Were they really fulfilling a prophecy? We have some hints about this because we know that Joseph's from the loins of Joseph of old, Joseph of Egypt.
Okay, you guys hear that? So understand, this is a smart man, a grown man, an adult man who worked for Homeland Security, who's been involved with several successful nonprofits. Because of his mistaken presuppositions, and this is where it shows you that everything really is about your source of authority. That's why we can't trust anything other than God's word, and it's important to try to get that thing right and drop our bad ideas and our bad interpretations. He believes Joseph Smith is a descendant of Joseph, therefore an Ephraimite. This is a Mormon painting rendition of Genesis 49. And I believe the person kneeling is supposed to be Joseph, who they believe, again, is Joseph Smith's ancestor, literally. So he's an Ephraimite according to them. Are you following all that? And again, it's Anglo-Israelism, and, they've codified the idea of white Israelites. By the way, Cherokee Gypsy, thank you for looking up Mr. Snow. I appreciate that. You're doing good work, for real.
A direct line, we are told. That is scriptural, right? That's in the Book of Mormon. Brigham Young said that Joseph Smith is a pure Ephraimite, that the blood is pure all the way through. And where does Joseph Smith hail from? Where are his people from? The British Isles. So that lines up with the archaeology and everything else. So back to John Howland.
Okay. Now, I don't think people caught in the previous clip one thing that he said there that I've got to replay again. So listen to this. Watch this.
Very end of the book, we are told there's going to be a coming again of Joseph to this land. There's going to be a restoration. They knew that it would happen again. And sure enough, it happens again when God takes a remnant of Joseph, Ephraim, takes them across Western Europe into the British Isles. And you really got to read the book to get into the details of all the archaeological and historical evidence of those migrations.
So just like Hebrew Israelites say that there's lots of archaeological and linguistic evidence that we're the real Israelites, he thinks the same thing, and so do the Anglo-Israelites.
Especially the linguists, the linguistics prove.
Especially the linguists. He claims that you can detect a change in the English language around a certain time. and he relies on people he views as linguistic historians and scholars who claim the influx of the change into the English language that we are able to detect, supposedly, comes from Semitic sources, meaning when Hebrews are moving into the British Isles. There's a clip where he actually says that English is 90% Hebrew. He literally says this. The crazy thing is, he's not the only person to say this stuff. That's what I'm saying. This stuff is way more prominent than people realize. It's at the Worldwide Church of God, this Anglo-Israelism. It's been in Mormonism. Hebrew Israelism is just the latest version of this, just the remix. They think it's so new and fresh, but it's not. So here's what we're learning about. We're learning about our Mormon neighbors here. We're learning more about American history. We're learning more about Tim Ballard. We're learning a lot here today. So be wise and listen carefully.
How English is really an adaptation and has a Hebrew in it because the languages merged and created English.
You hear that? You hear that? The man saying that this is not right, by the way. Now, I don't have time to debunk all old school Mormons who are like, well, vocab didn't really do nothing, except this is more explanation right now. I've debunked some of this in other places, but not some of this specifically. Anglo-Israelism itself, I think, has been thoroughly debunked. It's sort of a world into its own, and he's picking it back up.
English is about 90% Hebrew, believe it or not. So now the Pilgrims are from that group.
Believe it or not. You hear that?
Are they Ephraim? Are they the remnant that's going to fulfill this prophecy once again as children of Joseph, coming to the land of Joseph? The early generations of the church used to call America the land of Joseph for a reason. So these Pilgrims get on the Mayflower.
All right, next clip, Tim Ballard.
He had a daughter named Hope. Hope's great-great-great-granddaughter was Emma Smith. John Jr.'s great-great-great-grandson was Joseph Smith. So now the prophecy comes alive. Now we understand why John Howland could not die. He was bulletproof in every sense of the word.
I think I already played that clip. My bad. Let me jump to the next one.
Or the reestablishment.
All right, so some of these clips are out of order, and that's just my fault on how I downloaded them and how I was watching them. Now we're going to look at a different lecture Tim Ballard has given. Same hypothesis, same book. The main book is the Pilgrim Hypothesis, but he has older materials that he draws from here. Specifically, the covenant, one nation under God, which I believe there's more than one of these. But now he's broken it down into several things, and it's actually packaged quite well. He's improved it every time he puts it out. So listen to what he says here. The audio's a little lower on this one.
Or the reestablishment of this American covenant. We know where Manasseh went. We can follow Manasseh across the Atlantic and over to the New World.
Did you hear that? He's talking about lost tribes of Israel. This is Israelism again. We know where Manasseh went. We know. Who's Manasseh? Half tribe of Joseph. Who's Ephraim? Other half. 2 equal to 1. So now he's going to say, well, we know where Manasseh went. Well, where did Ephraim go? Well, he's going to tell us.
Well, what about Ephraim? If Ephraim was also to be an heir of this American covenant issued by Jacob.
Understand that? He thinks that Genesis 49 predicts something he is calling the American covenant. Now, I do believe that a nation is faithful to God, you will see blessings. But not because, like, America can have a covenant and other nations can't. It's sort of the principles of Deuteronomy 28, the beginning of the chapter, actually applied in real time to different nations. Doesn't mean covenants in the way that Israel of old, because when you talk about covenant, Christians got to understand new covenant. That's the church in Christ. So he, though, has this American covenant idea as if it's literally in Genesis 49 predicted.
Where did Ephraim go? Well, I can't get into it. I don't have time. But there's lots of scriptural and historical evidence that tell us that large parts of the blood of Ephraim went to Western Europe. And from Western Europe, the Lord then selected those people and brought them across the Atlantic. Now,
did you hear that? Again, Tim Ballard is a smart man. So he's putting things together because of the source of authority he takes seriously. So he's making a from his worldview, logical, cogent, hypothetically possible case that he thinks segues together nicely. And of course, he uses the BOM, Book of Mormon, to influence how he sees history. It has to do with his sources of authority being mistaken. So he, within that, is literally taking chunks of Anglo-Israelism and teaching in there, because that's been part of Mormonism in a sense for a while. A lot of people don't know that.
This is just a repeat of what happened with Lehi and Nephi. They crossed over, and the blessing was now in effect again. The American covenant was now in effect again. And here's where some fascinating things start happening. Here's a depiction of them on their boat, and the pilgrims crossing over.
Yes, William Butterfield. I know it's a lot, but Tim Ballard of The Sound of Freedom is Mormon. He's LDS, and this is him right here, the real guy, not Jim Caviezel teaching. I'm not telling people not to see the movie. They should see the movie. I'm not a conspiracy theorist. I'm not doing that. Movie's a good movie. And in fact, I would even say you could support his organizations. That's just me, because he's doing good work on that side of things, right? But now what we're talking about here, though, now is his books. Yes, Tim Ballard did work for the Department of Homeland Security. That's real. He really did. That's true, by the way. He truly did. And the sting operation that they did in the island that was portrayed in the movie, that really happened as well. So what I'm doing here is using this as a chance to talk about what he holds to as well, as far as his Mormonism, because we need to talk about Mormonism. He's talking about Mormonism.
Camp one day at the plantations just shows.
Okay, this is more Tim Ballard. What he's gonna say here is, it's pretty wild, man. According to an LDS president, founding fathers showed up, I guess, at the St. George Temple in Utah. And apparently they've been baptized, in proxy, because Mormons practice baptism for the dead. And apparently that was because they pleaded with him to do this. This is like in the 1800s. And he also is going to claim at various times in these clips, he believes that the angel Moroni, who was with George Washington and even Columbus, I guess. So all this is coming in these clips. Just wait. This is all in his book, too.
Camp one day at the plantations just shows up, and he speaks perfect English. That's not coincidence either. Okay, and he teaches them what they need to know. So this great kind of, again, this whole idea of the covenant transfer between Ephraim and Manasseh, just fascinating. So now we get into the revolutionary period.
Covenant transfer between Ephraim and Manasseh. Now, the stuff I was just talking about is going to be in later clips, not in this clip, and the clip's not over. Right now he's talking about Squanto. Squanto, amazing story. Eric Metaxas actually has a good children's book about Squanto. Amazing, amazing story. But he said, now we're going to see the covenant transfer between Ephraim and Manasseh. Because remember, he's holding that Native Americans are largely descendants of Manasseh. And the white settlers who were from Western Europe, a lot of them are from who? Ephraim. So that's what he's talking about.
I gave you one example of Washington's miracle, his miraculous escape. And I wish I had time to get into all the miracles because there's so many. But some that are really interesting, angels. Depicted angels in the camp of Washington. Did you know that Orson Hyde said that Moroni?
Orson Hyde's a Mormon leader, by the way. Angels in the camp of Washington, he says. This is what he really believes.
Depicted angels in the camp of Washington. Did you know that Orson Hyde said that Moroni, the Prince Guardian of America, he said this in general.
So Mormons believe that Moroni is the Prince Guardian of America. If you look at the top of a lot of LDS buildings, you see a little angel up there. That's Moroni.
Conference, an apostle of God, that Moroni was in the camps of Washington. And did you further know that there's an independent account?
Did you hear that? Tim Ballard believes that the angel Moroni, who we have no reason to believe he's actually a real biblical angel, maybe something else, if you know what I'm saying, but we don't really have a reason to believe he exists, was in the camps of Washington because Orson Hyde said so.
Of a visitation, an angelic visitation to Washington in the camps.
Now, I believe in angels. I believe you could have had angels, hypothetically, in the camps of Washington, whatever that would mean. But, it's Moroni, though?
His camps. There's also stories about Washington. Now, some are anecdotal, and if they are anecdotal, I give you what evidence there exists. Okay, I'm very honest about it. But there are interesting accounts of Washington seeking baptism by immersion, feeling inclined towards that ordinance, and several other miracles.
Do you hear that? Saying there's anecdotal potential accounts of Washington seeking baptism by immersion. Now, why is that significant? Well, if I'm not mistaken, I think Washington was like Episcopalian or something like that, which would mean, pedo baptism, infant baptism. And he's saying, he's seeking out the ordinance. Now, he views it something that the LDS Church has, baptism by immersion. He's saying that some of these founding fathers, remember, they're Ephraimites, according to him, they were seeking these ordinances that would later come into existence with the restoration of the church via Joseph Smith. I know it's a lot to follow, but that's what he's getting at there. They're longing for the restoration by them seeking, potentially, baptism as a believer.
Now, one of the most amazing, underreported events in American history is when George Washington, after winning the Revolution, becomes the first president.
Now, what he says there, I didn't get the full clip there. He claims when George Washington is sworn in, he goes to Genesis 49 and puts his finger on there. Remember, the Mormons are thinking Genesis 49 is a prophecy about Joseph's descendants coming over as Ephraimites to America. What tribe are Samoans and Tongans from? Might be, I think, the LDS folks would say, being that they would be indigenous in a very meaningful sense, that they would be of Manasseh. But don't quote me on that. Now, I don't hold they're Israelites at all. If you're GOCC, you hold that they're Naphtali, I believe. I think the rest of the Hebrew Israelites deny them, except maybe GMS. But that's one of the reasons you see such a heavy emphasis on them, because they believe it has to do with them being Israelites as well. Just continuing on with Tim Ballard here.
But some that are really interesting, angels depicted, angels in the camp of Washington. Did you know that Orson Hyde said that Moroni, the Prince Guardian of America, he said this in General Conference, an apostle of God, that Moroni was in the camps of Washington. And did you further know that there's an independent account of a visitation, an angelic visitation to Washington in the camps, in his camps. There's also stories about Washington. Now, some are anecdotal, and if they are anecdotal, I give you what evidence there exists. Okay, I'm very honest about it. But there are interesting accounts of Washington seeking baptism by immersion.
Now, if you could look it up, Orson Hyde, ORSONHYDE. What happens if you read a good amount of Mormonism? And believe it or not, I've read a decent amount on Mormonism, including modern Mormon authors and of old as well. I'm not saying, a ton, but I'm just saying some. Geronimo says, why are Mormons named Orson? I don't know the answer to that, but I don't think Orson Welles was a Mormon, first of all. But I think what happens is that there's a lot of, name your family member after da-da-da type of thing in LDS culture. And so you do get repetition of a lot of names. I think that happens. A lot of them are from a certain time in America's history. And so there's repetition of those names. There's also common names by Mormons themselves. Last names. Now I'm talking. In fact, chat, can you Google Russell M. Ballard? Russell M. Dot. That's his middle name initial. Ballard. Guess what? What's Tim Ballard's last name? Ballard, Ballard. Now, they're not related. I've already looked into this. They are not related. However, it's interesting that you have Russell M. Ballard, president of the church. If you look it up, you'll see. And then Tim Ballard. That's pretty common. Other names like Christensen. There's certain names that are somewhat McConkie. There's certain names that are you see kind of again and again. Snow. That's another one. Yada, yada, yada. Anyways, this next clip's a little bit longer than the other clips, so I'm going to pause it a few times. It's a 2-minute clip. Let's listen to this as we hear Tim Ballard speak, please.
On the bed and die next to her. And he was just devastated. Jefferson finds out about it and writes to him and says, John, don't worry. Don't you know that you'll be together forever? Eternal marriage is a real principle. And John Adams writes back and says, I know it's real. I can't read it anywhere. I can't find it anywhere, but I know it's real.
All right, let me explain this. If you take a tour of the Mormon temple, for example, thank you, William Butterfield. Someone's looking stuff up. That's who Russell M. Ballard is. By the way, I just told you, though, they're not related. I want everyone to make sure. They're not. Tim Ballard's not related. But it's interesting you see repetition of names common within LDS circles as you study their history. Okay, now here's what it is. Here's what it is, everybody. Here's what it is. Let's take a look at this here. Just hold on. I got a lot to say here.
On the bed and die next to her.
Gather my thoughts here. So if you take a tour of the temple, what you'll see is a heavy emphasis that they give. And when I say someone's going to say, you can't go in a temple, what I'm talking about is if you go to Salt Lake City in Utah, essentially to ground zero, you can get a tour and they take you through where you're allowed to be, okay? And they try to, this is going to sound disrespectful, but essentially sell you on Mormonism. And a key that they do, the key way they do that is this idea of eternally being with your family. So celestial marriage is very big, very important. Eternal marriage, I'm sorry. And remember, we've understood what Jesus said, where it says, hey, you know, in heaven, they're not going to be married, given to marry. That's not part of it, right? You all don't understand, remember? So we understood, okay, that's not part of the afterlife. The LDS theology definitely holds that. In fact, in certain instances, when you have exaltation, you're going to have a chance to populate your own planet, essentially being the god of that planet. And so it's a very real reality to have a wife and have her be pregnant and populate this, okay? Now, look, here's the deal. He's saying that a lot of these founding fathers, remember, he's claiming some of them are Ephraimites, had a longing for the restoration of the church, and Joseph Smith's one who brought that. So Mormons have a almost view of American history that it's divine. Now, a lot of Calvinists, like myself, do too as well from a different perspective. Now, I actually have some books I could recommend on that, and I might as well recommend some today. Some of these have controversial parts. I'm not saying I agree with everything, but let me go ahead and do it anyway. The Judeo-Christian Tradition by Gary North. Interesting book. I can recommend a book without believing everything the author ever says or everything in the book. These are food for thought type books to say, how do we get at this similar idea and look at it from a more biblical perspective? These are some books that might help you do that. God and Government, Biblical, Historical, and Constitutional Perspective, put out by AV, American Vision, Gary DeMar. Nice little thick book. I think these are some helpful things. And let me recommend a more lay-level one from a non-Calvinist thing, Master Books. That's ICR's publishing arm. Faith of Our Founding Fathers. Books like this are often made fun of or by mainstream, and I get that. And sometimes they get things wrong, but they're basically more right than a lot of the other versions of history that you'll get. But Tim Ballard now is saying John Adams, after Abigail died, said, hey, what about eternal marriage? I wish it was real. I know it's got to be real. And Thomas Jefferson's like, yeah, it is pretty much real. That's what he's saying.
And he was just devastated. Jefferson finds out about it and writes to him and says, John, don't worry. Don't you know that you'll be together forever? Eternal marriage is a real principle. And John Adams writes back and says, I know it's real. I can't read it anywhere. I can't find it anywhere, but I know it's real. And I believe that too. Because Jefferson lost his wife early in his life as well, his wife Martha. Well,
he's saying that the founding fathers, John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, had an inkling that key elements of Mormon theology must be true. Specifically, he's talking about eternal marriage there. And he talks about this in his book, pages 218, 219, 220, 221. And he talks about the letters they exchange. Again, I like the book because it has a lot of true American history in it. I've read the whole thing. It's well put together. It's an easy read, captivating. He writes well. It presents his theory in an intriguing way. But it's got a lot of nonsense in it. He relies upon the Book of Mormon, Joseph Smith, and he interprets history in strange ways because of his worldview.
The miracle continues because we know that in August of 1877, Jefferson, along with his wife, stepchildren, and his step-grandchildren, and an abundance of other people, showed up to the St. George Temple and appeared to okay?
I got to rewind that.
The miracle continues because...
Understand, Mormons believe that you can baptize people by proxy. I talked a little bit about this with the Midnight Mormons. What it means is you weren't alive or aware or didn't accept the gospel, essentially, of Mormonism during your life, post-mortem, someone stands in for you. They say that person's name, you go under, whatever. And it means that now in the afterlife, that person, the real person, has a chance to hear and accept or deny the truth about Mormonism. Now, that's not the way they would phrase it, okay? And so even A.H., the guy with Germany during the 30s and 40s, A.H., if you know what I mean, with WW2, he's been baptized via proxy. What he's saying here is this happened here with the founding fathers at the St. George Temple. St. George is a beautiful place in Utah. And he's saying that Woodruff, a guy who was an actual, Mormon president, testified to this. Sorry about the breaking up. I'll try to make some adjustments
here. We know that in
here.
August of 1877, Jefferson, along with his wife, stepchildren, and his step-grandchildren, and an abundance of other people, showed up to the St. George Temple and appeared to Wilford Woodruff and had their covenants done, had their work done for them.
Had their covenants done. Had their work done for them. Well, let's read it from his book. Let me explain to you what he's saying here. So this is the kind of stuff Mormon prophets claim is true. This is the kind of stuff that serious men believe. All right? I'm reading from the book here. This is page 229 of Tim Ballard's book, The Pilgrim Hypothesis. All right? Usually, the story would end there, but in the case of Adams and Jefferson, it does not. For they are two of the very few in history whose activities in the afterlife have been documented. What? Do you understand what the man is saying? This is what he believes for real. They had identified the apostasy. They had sought a restoration. Most importantly, they had looked forward to the blessings of eternal marriage that would be made possible only in the forthcoming temples of God. They had laid the foundation for these. By the way, because to have eternal marriage, you got to have it done properly in a Mormon temple. That's what he's saying. They laid the foundation for these temples to come to earth because of the freedom America brought, so then the temples could come. And the temples did come. And one in particular plays a significant role in our story, the St. George, Utah Temple, August 1877. The temple president was Apostle Wilford Woodruff, who received a stunning revelation. Along with George Washington, the signers of the Declaration of Independence appeared to Elder Woodruff in the temple. He recorded the following, quote, 2 weeks before I left St. George, the spirits of the dead gathered around me, wanting to know why we did not redeem them. Said they, you have had the use of the endowment house for a number of years, and yet nothing has ever been done for us. We laid the foundation of the government you now enjoy, and we never apostatized from it, but we remain true to it and were faithful to God. This is what George Washington is saying to Woodruff, apparently. And by the way, at the time, this man, Woodruff, was just the temple president, but he became an apostle later on and the president of the Mormon church. So he's a considered living prophet at that time. You guys understand? All right, here we go. I straightway went to the baptismal font and called upon Brother McAllister to baptize me for the signers of the Declaration of Independence and 50 other eminent men. Are you guys following here? This is not a random Mormon in 1877 talking. This is a guy who became the prophet of the restored church later on. I'm using Mormon lingo here, okay? So this man, all right, what's his name? His name is Wilford Woodruff, is saying George Washington and those guys appeared to him, and then he went into the baptismal font and had a guy baptized, Brother McAllister, to baptize him for who? The signers of the Declaration of Independence and 50 other eminent men. I'm going to continue with this quote. Are you following this? On the same day these ordinances were performed, Sister Lucy Bigelow Young, another prominent name among Mormons, Brigham Young, Steve Young, the quarterback, remember, went forth into the font and was baptized for 70 of the eminent women of the world. So men for men and women for women, I guess, but I think it can go either way on that. In an effort to express that the above event was not some invention of mind or a formalistic rite of passage, Elder Woodruff recorded that he spoke with these individuals. He uses the word argued, and that they had pled to him that their ordinances be done as a man pleading for his life, end quote. I'm reading Tim Ballard's words now, but he's quoting Woodruff. Later, upon performing the baptisms, Elder Woodruff noted that it seemed, quote, as if the room was filled as if with a flaming fire. Continuing on here, page 230 of Ballard's book, Elder Woodruff recorded in his journal, as well as in the annals of the St. George Temple, the names of these people whose work was done pursuant to the heavenly visitation. I saw the list, and when I did, 4 names jumped out at me as if they had been written in bold print: John and Abigail Adams, Thomas and Martha Jefferson. It appears as though they received what they sought, what they deserved, what they built. They had fulfilled their roles as gatherers of Israel. This man, Tim Ballard, is saying John Adams and Thomas Jefferson are gatherers of Israel and forerunners of the restoration, and were now receiving their just reward. So on this part, he has a thing called a prophet's testimony, and pictured there is the St. George Temple. All right. More than 2 decades after the St. George Temple vision, Wilford Woodruff, now president of the church, stood at the April 1898 General Conference. Gen Con is when Mormons believe that the president who received direct revelation for God's church, and I talked a little bit about this with Jacob Hansen in our conversation, that's when they give distinctive revelation for the church at that time, although it's not infallible. Remember what Jacob said? And made one final declaration, continuing here with the book, about what had happened. Quote, another thing I'm going to say here, because I have a right to say it. See the way they talk? They think they're prophets of God, bro. The prophet stated, every one of those men that signed the Declaration of Independence with General Washington called upon me as an apostle of the Lord Jesus Christ in the temple at St. George 2 consecutive nights, and demanded at my hands that I should go forth and attend to the ordinances of the house of God for them. So George Washington begged the president of the Mormon Church 2 decades earlier that he would have them be baptized in proxy. So let's continue on here with the video and see.
I don't have time to get into them. They all showed up. Men and women alike. More women than men, in fact, showed up.
They all showed up. Understand, they're dead. But he's saying they showed up.
Okay. Another underreported part of our history. Now, I don't have time or really an inclination to get too much into this part of the book. There's a chapter here, I believe, for too long, we have run.
Okay. This part's fascinating. Several of you brought this up. You said, what about Masonry and Mormonism? I don't go deep into the Mason stuff. I don't really do that here. However, this clip is fascinating. Tim Ballard, the star of the Sound of Freedom movie, which I still recommend to you. We can have nuanced positions on these issues. We must be mature Christians. Tim Ballard is going to say Mormons should stop running from their Masonic past. Are you listening to some of you who do have a lot of theories about Masons? And I'm not saying that I don't have anything to say about them, but I'm not really going to get into it here. He's going to say, hey, these dudes were Masons. We got a lot of Masons in our past and our history, and we shouldn't be ashamed of it. Listen to what Tim Ballard says here. Pay attention. Here's the clip.
Now, I don't have time or really an inclination to get too much into this part of the book. There's a chapter entitled Ancient Orders, Founding Fathers, and the Temple of God. These were special people that understood something. And I believe, for too long, we have run from the fact that Joseph Smith and almost all the apostles in that first generation were Masons. Ooh, they were Masons. Let's not talk about it. Let's run from it. Let's pretend that it means nothing, okay? But when you look at the evidence, it had to mean something. I don't have time to get into it all. But instead of running from it, with the American covenant, with the understanding of the American covenant, and what the founders' part in this whole thing was, we can understand that Masonry is nothing but a representation of ancient orders that go back to Adam. Okay, and I get into it in my book. You're not going to believe me right now. You're going to think, oh, crazy quack, Ballard, whatever. Read, just I promise you, read it. Okay, and then you can embrace this idea that Joseph Smith, like George Washington before him, was a master Mason, and there was a reason for it. And I'm not going to get into it. These are things better read in the privacy of your own home. But you're going to recognize a lot of things in here. This There's a reason George Washington was attracted to Masonic symbols like the compass and square and implanted them into the architecture. He designed it. This is Washington, D.C.
Yo. 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 Are you guys following this? By the way, if you have problems with audio, just refresh. Should be all right. Try that. Are you guys following this, man? This is fascinating. Now, look, I got audio coming out Tuesday, and it's going to be with Jacob Hansen, and it's going to be of Thoughtful Faith. It's going to be all about this question. We talk about it for like an hour. Are Mormons Christian? And what I say is the LDS Church is not a Christian church. Former LDS here, Zelf Bones. Vocab used to call me and check up on me. Much love. Well, are you the gentleman from Mesa? I'm not sure because the name is Zelf Bones, but yeah, I have a heart for Mormon people, and I'm glad that you're former. Praise God, and I pray you're walking in the true light of Christ now. So that clip, man, that's like worth its weight in gold, right? I mean, come on now. I see you live chat, live and up, popping up off of that one, but we can't focus too much on that. We got to keep it moving here. Check out this clip as well, because this is fascinating.
Here's Ben Franklin, another person understood. There's a reason that you stand in the rotunda of the U.S. Capitol and look up, and there's a depiction of George Washington receiving his exaltation. This is the apotheosis of Washington. That's the title. Apo meaning to become, and theos meaning God. And then below this are imagery of the American covenant. Below this is Nephi's vision. These great oil on canvas murals, pictures of Nephi's vision. Everything he saw in his vision, you stand in the rotunda and just go in a circle, and it's supporting symbolically this gospel principle.
Okay. Now, here's what's going on. He's saying somehow this truth of Mormonism has seeped through various elements of American history and even in its symbolism. Specifically, this idea where George Washington is sort of portrayed as like a figure from Greco-Roman antiquity. This is a real painting where he's upon death kind of being deified in some kind of way. It is kind of odd. It is kind of weird. Understand, though, he is tying it into theosis, meaning to become God, to become a god. Under the Mormon recognition. I'm not talking about, see, this is where it gets confusing. I'm not talking about what the Eastern Orthodox talk about, because they don't really mean what Mormons mean, even though they use the same terminology, because it's been co-opted. Now, some of this, you're not going to follow what I'm saying unless you look up all these words. Sometimes it just be like that. Okay. But what he's saying is, there's a reason why George Washington, who he's somehow tying it in with Masonry, is depicted in a way that we Mormons would find accurate, truthful, faithful, because he's depicted as becoming a god. That's what Mormons call exaltation, more commonly. Exaltation. Exaltation is going from to man to God. Exaltation. And apparently they're saying this painting represents this happening to George Washington. I know that's a lot to take in. I wish I could play the clip again. Let me just play the clip again.
Here's Ben Franklin, another person understood. There's a reason that you stand in the rotunda of the U.S. Capitol and look up, and there's a depiction of George Washington receiving his exaltation. This is the apotheosis of Washington. That's the title. Apo meaning to become, and theos meaning God. And then below this are imagery of the American covenant. Below this is Nephi's vision. These great oil on canvas murals, pictures of Nephi's vision. Everything he saw in his vision, you stand in the rotunda and just go in a circle, and it's supporting symbolically this gospel principle.
Okay. Now, when they say gospel principle, they mean the principle essentially of Mormonism. Now, in the next clip, what I'm going to show you, also fascinating. Because remember, he's relaying all these things within Mormonism to American history. he's basically going to say, and I've read the larger book and also looked at the larger work. He has another one called the Lincoln Hypothesis. This one will relate to more, but I've watched many of his lectures on this topic. He's going to basically say that the Civil War was punishment for what America did to Mormons and what was done to Joseph Smith. He would probably partially say, he would throw probably slavery in there because, he's a modern man. And he would say that's truthful as well. But listen to what he says here.
And then he made a warning. He said, if you don't do this, God will come upon you, and it's going to be hell on wheels for America. He's going to make you do this if you don't do it. Well, he won't make you, of course, but he'll influence you to the point where you will do it. Okay?
I found that fascinating. Now, let me show you this. It's saying Joseph Smith prophesied the Civil War as punishment for America's evil. By the way, I believe that's basically true, but Joseph Smith, I'm saying that the Civil War is a judgment upon America. True, but it's not because of whatever Joseph Smith did or didn't say. Okay, but it's going to be related to how he was treated and things like that. And the Mormon's view of covenant is what Ballard is saying. But it gets deeper than that. He's going to say, well, if you don't accept these gospel principles, if you don't accept this American covenant, God's going to make you. But then he catches himself. Well, not make you, of course, but make it where you're going to want to. Why? Why that's interesting. Tim Ballard has an interesting conundrum here. On one hand, he's an LDS member. They're very anti-Calvinist, more so than many other faiths, because of the prominence of the doctrine of what Mormons call agency, choice, essentially autonomous choice in many ways, okay? Man is at the center, of this religion. Man's will, man's emotions, my goodness, man's epistemology, everything. So here, he's going to say, because he can't have a God who acts that way. Even though if you read the Old Testament, God acts that way. If you read the book of Jonah, God acts that way. You go through, God acts that way. You read what happened to Nebuchadnezzar, God acts that way. You know what I'm saying? But not for him. But he's in a conundrum because he's reading the Pilgrims and seeing their view of providence, which is God's working in everyday history and everyday happenings, God's hand on matters, Providence, Rhode Island, Roger Williams, of course. He's seeing that and seeing God's hand like the Pilgrims did, but he can't see it through the lens they saw it, which is a Calvinistic or Reformed view, strongly predestinarian, sovereignty of God emphasized within that understanding of the Bible, which I would follow. He's going to try to utilize their insights like Bradford's writing about Plymouth, but then he has to Mormonize it. It's very fascinating if you follow what I'm saying. It's a conundrum for him. But watch this again, okay? Watch this again what he says.
And then he made a warning. He said, if you don't do this, God will come upon you, and it's going to be hell on wheels for America. He's going to make you do this if you don't do it. Well, he won't make you, of course, but he'll influence you to the point where you will do it. Okay? And he told them time and again, he wrote letters to Congress. He said this government's going to fall apart. You have to do what I'm saying. And why did he say that? Because
you have to do what I'm saying. Oh, Joseph Smith. You know Joseph Smith ran for president? Did you guys know that? A lot of you guys didn't know that. He did.
The happy ending is, guess who was also in the St. George Temple?
So now he's talking about Lincoln, and he's going to tell us that Lincoln showed up at the St. George Temple as well.
With the founders. Abraham Lincoln was there. And at his side, according to the records of Wilford Woodruff, was William Seward.
He believes Seward essentially prophesied Joseph Smith, I guess, or something like that.
Both there. Even though how many of us even knew who William Seward was before today? Okay, he was there. These are American covenant makers. And what of the Union soldiers? They went through a similar process. They were American covenant makers.
American covenant makers. Now, look, shout out to AZB Boy. We got some people who apparently know my old music. Zelf Bones knows Happy Hardcore album. My man, AZB Boy. Shout out to everybody who's talking about the old music. I appreciate that. You guys know I do have music on Spotify. I do have music on iTunes. You got to look for a few different things. Look up Vocab Alone. Look up Vocab and Cree, because the active listening album. And then make sure you look up the Columbus Connection. That one's the hardest to find, but you can find it. Now, look, there's more to be said here. I have more clips. I have more to say. I have more quotes out of this book I want to cover. I see how this isn't the most popular thing. I have more I want to say about Tim Ballard. But we might need to wind down pretty soon. Any questions from the audience? Because here's what we're learning today here. Zelf Bones, a former Mormon himself, says, my grandmother told me stories of the presidents of the U.S. supposedly appearing in spirit. And understand, this makes sense. Mormons believe, because of what Joseph Smith said, that the Constitution is a divine document. Now, I believe that we can believe God used men, and there's a lot of biblical worldview wisdom in there and all that. But that's different than essentially putting it on the same level of Scripture, right? Oh, Zelf Bone says, my older brother was married in the St. George, Utah temple. I heard it's beautiful out there. Seriously, William? Look at this. It's messed up, bro. Are you? Maybe your car seat he was getting old. How about that? Jeez, man. That's all right, man. You know I love you, bro. Come back to Phoenix and say what's up. Say what's up. Okay. So, basically, though, why I wanted to do this is to show you that a lot of people don't know that Tim Ballard, the real-life hero of the movie Sound of Freedom, which I'm still recommending heartily to you to see. No reservations on my end about that. Tim Ballard does good work in the real world. But he writes books, and he's a serious Mormon man who sees things through the certain eyes. And it goes back to Columbus. He believes that Columbus was prophesied in the Book of Mormon. We didn't even get into that tonight. He believes that all this relates to the regathering of Israel and the restoration of the gospel. This is how a Mormon would view history if they're taking these stuff seriously. Yeah, Jimmy James, you could definitely post it. In fact, post clips, I appreciate it, Jimmy James. So we're learning about the ins and outs of Mormonism through a different way. We're learning more about Tim Ballard. And this is helpful for us to see because along the way, we learned some real things about American history. We do learn some about God's providential acting in history. So those are good things, right? But we also learn about some of the wackiness and mistakes of Mormonism. False prophets, men saying things, baptism for the dead, eternal marriage. The list goes on and on and on. And so I hope this is helpful because we need to know our Mormon neighbors better. So the information I give you is not to make fun of Mormons. The information I give you is not to look down on them. Nothing like that, okay? The information I give you is so you can have a greater understanding of these things and move in wisdom, Christians. We match our knowledge with love and grace, I pray. This is not just information to have information. Geronimo says, respect to Tim Ballard for his vigilance to protect child from abuse and exploitation. But he is still a member of a shoddy cult that convolutes Christ. So that's close to my own view. I may put it in somewhat different words, but I think that's a good, sophisticated view where you say, hey, we can respect and admire what he does as an image bearer of God over here, but then we recognize the faulty organization that he's dedicated himself to as well over there. And we can talk about that, okay? What about it, Michael D. Castro? Tell me what you mean. Interesting. I don't think I would agree with you, but let us know. Shovey says, do you still think he holds these views? Yes, he does. I follow him on Instagram, and Tim Ballard recently appeared with President Russell M. Ballard, not related, and called him a great spiritual leader and all this type of stuff. And this book, Pilgrim Progress, is only from 2020. So he does. So this is not old. He went to Catholic schools, but I don't know if he was raised Mormon. I know that he has a CrossFit gym in Draper, Utah. Tim Ballard has a CrossFit gym there in Draper. And I think it's called ORU CrossFit because his organization that he was part of, that he founded, I believe, was called ORU. It's something Underground Railroad. Operation Underground Railroad, I think it is, because they're rescuing children from trafficking, And so, look, we're learning a lot about this here. And so I pray that this blessed you today. There's more to say.